I'd like to introduce you to today's presenter, Matt Baker. For the past 20 years, Matt has worked in the learning and performance space, supporting the manufacturing, retail, IT, and consulting industries. Matt has supported clients as an on-site consultant, project manager, solutions architect, and account manager over the course of his career. Currently, Matt leads GP Strategy Sales Enablement Practice and consulting practices. So Matt, it's a pleasure to have you here with us today, and now I would like to turn the session over to you.
Thank you, Kayla. I'd like to thank everybody for joining today. With curation being such a hot topic in the L&D space, we'll focus our webinar today on the critical elements organizations truly need to focus on in order to establish a holistic, effective, and sustainable enterprise curation model. To set the stage, as we all know, today's organizational learning requirements are evolving and really being led by how we as people access and share information in today's digital world. At the same time, the way corporations and organizations enable and equip learner populations is also continuously evolving. Learning is becoming increasingly focused on how individuals desire to learn and grow, and really being self-selective in how they engage at different times within the learning process. Learners require learning that adheres to the pace of business, and in many cases really requires being out ahead of those pivot points or changes in order to ensure that organizations and individuals are ready to meet the challenges that lie ahead. From an insights perspective, organizations now are continuously moving to leveraging insights and data to really align and pivot where necessary the focus of their learning and their enablement strategies. And lastly, from a larger picture perspective, really ensuring that, especially in a curation model, learning becomes guided, and it really enables learners to learn in a way that's most relevant and meaningful to them. The shifts that I've just described in how learners are being engaged is leading many organizations to pursue and establish enterprise curation strategies, with the ultimate goal of really optimizing the ultimate learner experience. Moving to this type of enterprise curation model really requires organizations to think through many strategic decision and design points. How does learning become personalized yet still aligned to business objectives? From a content perspective, what gets bought, what gets built, what gets sourced, and how do we organize that in a way that's most meaningful and relevant to the learner population? What is the role of technology, and how does that technology ultimately support not only the strategy, but how learners ultimately engage within the learning process? And what is the role of organizational leadership within this new type of learning model? At the end of the day, that all these things really require changes, and within that, all these are critical considerations that are ultimately need to be focused on to create an effective, sustainable enterprise curation model. As we establish, the ultimate goal is to optimize learner experience by providing contextually relevant content and assets that engage the learner in a way that is most effective for them. In this graphic today, this graphic really comprises and represents strategic elements of a sound curation strategy that we've learned and uncovered through experience with our client base. And within each of these, obviously the goal really starts and ends with optimizing that learner experience. But as we continue through our conversation today, and where we'll end, is these are all some of the critical elements that organizations should be considering or taking a look at as they look to establish or continue to enhance their organizational enterprise curation strategy. Based on our experience, governance really is the glue that ultimately holds the strategy together. There are certainly many ways to tackle a problem, but for large-scale enterprise curation models, having a sound governance strategy is critical to success and the long-term sustainability of the overarching program. As we look back and as we look at the graphic on the screen, our governance approach really starts at the upfront phase of strategic planning and goes all the way through continuous improvement, including evolve and innovation, these are all critical elements of this governance success platform. And with that, there's many things throughout that are going to be critical to success. So elements such as vendor management. In many cases, many of the organizations we partner with have different technologies. They source content or license content from different vendors, and getting all those vendors on the same page to really support the needs and objectives of your organization really requires a purposeful approach and model. At the same token, having clear processes and clear swim lanes and lines of responsibility for who owns and manages those processes is also critical. And as we continue through our conversation today, some of these elements include, how do we ultimately format content? How does this show up when the learner engages? What types of formats and modalities are we going to leverage? What are those review processes and approval processes that learning pathways and ultimately content need to undergo prior to ever being accessible to the learner base? And at the same token, from a change management perspective, we've certainly seen that in these, as organizations shift to a true enterprise curation strategy, having purposeful communication strategies, being really clear about what the changes are organizationally, and then ultimately ensuring that there's a purposeful two-way communication channel from the learner base back to those managing this process. These are all part of that governance strategy and will ultimately enable you to effectively manage not only the process, but to also more meaningfully engage your end user or learner population within this model. If content is queen, context is king. We oftentimes start, in many cases, organizations tend to come to us and say, hey, we need to rationalize our content. And certainly from a curation strategy perspective, that is definitely a critical element that needs to be undergone. And I'll really bucket this aspect into two key buckets. Number one is, as you're establishing learner journeys or learner pathways, really identifying how you want to engage the learner. Is information going to be presented from a topical basis, a role-based perspective, or even guided versus self-guided? And if it's a combination of all of those, how does that show up to the learners? So that definitely is a critical element, number one, of your overarching curation and content strategy. From a content perspective, this really is the focus of, what do you have today? What does that need to look like tomorrow? And in order to get there, what needs to be bought, what needs to be built, and what needs to be sourced? And with all that said, you've got to have, going back to governance, processes, templates, and guidelines in place to ultimately ensure that as content gets presented to the learner population or as learning pathways get established, there are clear checkpoints and review processes to ensure that ultimately the content that gets presented aligns to organizational standards. The next critical element certainly is on the change and communications front. And ultimately, this is really where critical change obviously occurs. Not telling you anything anyone on this call doesn't already know, but this also really starts with engagement. So how do we establish a communication strategy and plan up front, and then continuously engage the overarching learner populations throughout the process? How do we establish where and how the role of leaders changes? One of the critical elements we've seen is, as you move to a full curation model, especially if you're using learning platforms, it's critical that behavior changes within leadership are exhibited and really showcased to the learner population. And not only that, it's the reinforcement strategies. So how are folks being checked in on or followed up on or really welcomed into this type of model? At the same token, from a feedback perspective, it's really critical to establish a two-way feedback mechanism, not only throughout, but really at the early onset, to really engage and solicit feedback from learners to ensure that what's being presented, how it's being presented, how things are being reached out to them all that incorporates their feedback to ultimately optimize their learner experience, which is really the ultimate goal. That gets us to user engagement. User engagement will ultimately determine how successful these types of programs truly are. Getting buy-in and adoption will lead to more utilization of the platform and the model, and ultimately drive more effective organizational learning. Some of these critical elements from an engagement perspective are certainly ease of use and accessibility. How do you get information into the learner's hands in a way that's meaningful, relevant, and contextually within the confines of their role? How are things presented, or how are things teed up as far as in alignment with their role? And how does that align to their individual and organizational goals? So it's critical that all of the learning pathways, all of the learner journeys, all these things align organizationally and systematically to really promote individual learning that enables folks to become better within their role and equips them for their next role. We talked about the quality of content and the effectiveness of pathways. So that, again, is another critical element. How do you promote peer-to-peer interaction? How do you promote sharing of best practices or sharing of content, or really drive more effective engagement? We talked about some of the changes from a leadership perspective, and one of the things that I will say that we've seen most effective is where the leadership truly sets the tone. So whether they share new posts, whether they enhance some of the content, whether they engage their teams or teams outside of their purview, all these things are critical elements to engaging the masses. Leveraging data and analytics is another critical element to determine effectiveness and fit. There's many KPIs that you can measure, but certainly recommend you follow some basic tenets. So especially early on within a true curation strategy, what was consumed? What needs or need did it meet? What was shared and how was it shared? What are individuals looking for that they can't either access or find? Who are individuals following? What topics or groups are they following? And we've partnered with many organizations, and again, as you can see just based on this small list, of which there's certainly many more, but we typically look at things such as learner consumption. How are folks engaging with different content assets or pathways? From an adoption perspective, how often are folks checking into the system? How often are they sharing or promoting content to their peers or the larger group? And then organizationally, how is this ultimately impacting the business? So are you able to draw clear lines of how learning is either, as some examples, decreasing cost, driving down time to competency, et cetera? As one of my colleagues once told me, it's not about the technology. With so many tools and platforms in the marketplace today, it's critical to select the platforms of your choice based on organizational fit, scalability, long-term effectiveness, and ultimately, how do these things align with your IT or L&D organizational roadmap? We've partnered with many organizations that use some combination of any of these tools, and this is certainly a small representative list of tools, but certainly we've partnered with clients where they leverage learning management systems. They leverage different data tools to really enhance what's being measured and what's being reported. And certainly leveraging tools, especially in today's world, like Degreed and EdCast as really the user interface with how learners engage with this type of platform and system. At the end of the day, there's a lot of ways to tackle this challenge, but really doing your due diligence up front and making sure that the needs of the technology or your needs from a technology front long-term are ultimately being met with the right tools. We all know, so at the end of the day here with capacity and resource planning, a lot of folks that we engage with, they always tell us, we bought the tool and now everything else should fall into place, right? Well, everyone on this call certainly knows that's not the case. And one of the most critical elements of making these types of programs a success really is the resource and capacity planning side of things. As we look, there's a lot of different roles that really promote the long-term effectiveness of these types of strategies, and it really helps ultimately define things such as escalation and risk management. Who's ultimately responsible? What are the swim lanes and responsibilities of individuals? Whether it's product managers, whether it's the actual content curators, the governance team. We talked about review processes. So at the end of the day, in many cases, a lot of organizations really underestimate the number of folks and the time required to really truly roll out an effective strategy. So in closing, as we really look at some of these critical elements we've walked through at a high level today, ultimately the goal is really to engage and optimize the learner experience. And through this, we've seen organizations increase their effectiveness in learning and some of the retention that they've been able to deploy through new learning pathways and new programs, really give the learner a better way to access training at the point of need, and really give them a one-stop shop way to engage with learning in order to make that more self-guided and self-directed. As a takeaway, I would definitely encourage anyone considering or in the midst of an enterprise curation strategy rollout to really review your plan against these elements to ensure that, at the end of the day, you really have a sound and holistic strategy to ensure not only early adoption, but also long-term sustainability and success. With that, I thank everybody for your time today, and we'll now open up things for the Q&A portion of the call.
Great. Well, thank you, Matt, for that presentation. We have a few minutes left for Q&A, so just as a reminder, if you have a question for Matt, just enter it into the Q&A module this time. Again, that's in the lower right-hand panel of WebEx. You just type your question right there into the chat box. Matt covered quite a bit in less than 20 minutes, and there's obviously still more information to discuss, so we encourage you to continue the conversation today. Matt, if you don't mind, just flip to the next slide so that folks can see your contact info. I definitely encourage you to reach out to him beyond today's session. And also, as a reminder, we'll be sending everyone a link to the recording and slides from today, so you will receive the PowerPoint. Quite a few people asked us that. There's a lot of great info in there. This will be sent to the email address that you provided when you registered, and we'll also be sending a blog post where Matt will be addressing some of the key takeaways from today, in addition to actually writing out some additional thoughts to the questions that came in. So it looks like we have some questions coming in. The first one I want to jump into, Matt, if you're ready, is how much of a role does change management play in moving to this type of a learning model?
Yeah, I think change is definitely a critical element. And where some of the things that we've really seen take hold are certainly from a communications perspective. Having the upfront communications plan to inform the learners on what's going to come down the pipe, how it's going to impact and, more importantly, benefit them, but also how do you change the leadership? How do you get them enrolled and engaged within this process to help drive early adoption, but also longer-term sustainability? So based on our experience and based on what I've seen to date, change management is definitely a critical element to success.
There you go. I mean, we have a lot of questions coming in, so bear with me. I'm going to kind of go right from one to the next. One concern that this person has is that safeguarding their content. So how do you manage ensuring what is available meets standards?
Yeah, great question. I think for how I would answer that is it really all comes back to the governance strategy. So, as part of that strategy, you've got to have clear and defined review processes set up, and this goes back to some of the things I shared today, but it's also establishing what are those standards up front. How do you format learning pathways? What are the content standards that you're going to align to organizationally? And that includes things that you buy, build, or purchase. And, just as one example to that concern, through the course of client interaction, building out a learning pathway, we sourced some content from an external place, and the first 45 seconds of this particular content asset, it was great. The messaging was on point. It really supported the point of the learning pathway. But 50 seconds in, as the camera kind of panned out, it showcased what was eventually uncovered to be a sermon. And obviously, in that example, that would probably not be relevant or appropriate for a working professional environment. But without us safeguarding and putting measures in place to review content, we never would have caught that. So that's again an example of having the right processes and protocols in place up front is definitely critical to ensuring quality work product that gets ultimately presented to the learners.
Well, the next question I'm going to jump into actually has a little bit to do with the one that you just answered, so I'm not going to get into the first part of the question, but the second one is, second half of it is more, what are your thoughts on allowing user feedback to drive what's meaningful with the content, in addition to reviewing?
Okay, yeah, that's great. So user feedback definitely is critical, and establishing what those processes are early, especially if you're going to roll out a platform like a Degreed, an EdCast, it's really critical to get that buy-in and feedback from the learner population. And it's critical as you look at things such as formatting, timing, effectiveness. So those are some of those critical elements that we recommend actively seeking feedback from the learner population in order to pivot where pivot's required. But at the end of the day, we're doing this to enable the learners, and it's got to resonate and it's got to be teed up in a way that is contextually relevant for them.
Absolutely. When implementing something like this across an entire organization or enterprise, do you recommend piloting first with a smaller business unit?
Yes, yes. Great question. So yeah, in many cases we have partnered with folks, and we've even seen other clients where they selected a particular business area or select pilot test group. And we would definitely recommend that strategy just because, again, if you're using different platforms, you definitely want to work out some of the kinks and really have a good test market to give you the requisite time to really pressure test everything and make sure when it gets rolled out across the enterprise, some of those initial quirks and bugs are worked out.
Great. Now, going back to, sorry, the questions are coming in so quickly, I'm losing them as I'm reading them. Let's see, can you discuss the different types of content? Let's see, we went through that one. Here we go. Sorry, they're moving very quickly. This one is, do you recommend, it's kind of going back again to the review question, there's a lot around this topic. Do you recommend establishing a governance council or group? If so, is there an optimal number of participants, and what disciplines or functions should they represent?
So I'll try to answer all the elements of that question. So yes, I would definitely recommend having a governance council, steering committee, whatever your term of choice is. We've seen the most effective to really have representation from different aspects of not only the L&D community, but certainly from an IT perspective. If you're leveraging different technology platforms, it's critical that decisions be informed within the IT community, but also within the business. So getting enrollment from the business and from the leadership is also another critical element, not only for decision-making purposes, but as you begin to roll this out, getting those business unit leaders enrolled so they can then help drive adoption within their teams and those whom they report into them is also another key benefit. So ensuring everyone's uniform, in their understanding of what's going to change, when it's going to change, will also ultimately help drive some of the early successes and quick wins.
And the next question actually kind of ties to that when you bring up leadership. This person's question is around what are some effective ways to get the leaders to curate content and show that to employees?
Yeah, so we've seen different elements and different ways of approaching this, but some ways to engage leadership include, on the low end, getting them to publicly post, hey, just walked through this learner journey or just looked at this particular asset and, recommending that to their team. And on the high end, certainly as new opportunities arise from that require new learning, really helping them engage, getting them engaged with the L&D team to set what that learning pathway is or to make recommendations for different assets. So we've just found that if the leaders are not exhibiting this new behavior, they're not engaging with the system, it's really going to water down or diminish their team's engagement level with this, new approach.
Well, I'm going to take one more question because we are about 6 minutes over. We're not going to ignore anyone else's questions. What we're going to do is I'm going to compile them into the blog post and have Matt address them in his follow-up blog post. So please keep the questions coming in. I will actually, when we wrap this up, keep the webinar open for just a few minutes if you want to go ahead and type some more questions or thoughts into the chat module. I'm happy to pass those over to Matt. So finally, just to round this out, what have you found to be the most successful construct for organizing content, skills, roles, or other?
I think it's a combination of all of them. And so, and the reason I say that is there's different compliance topics that are applicable to everybody across the board, and really driving a more engaging way of enlisting in those topics is critical. But then as it relates to role specifics, really looking at what are those critical elements. And if you think about breaking out content, there's a lot of ways to do it, but looking at new to role, in role, and how do you break out the learning pathways within the different aspects of that individual's role. So to me, I would definitely recommend it's a blend of all, and there's different contexts that are, yield better results potentially than others.
Well, Matt, I certainly appreciate these answers and everyone's great questions. Again, keep them coming into the Q&A module. We'll make sure to include them into the blog post. So I'd like to say thank you again to today's speaker, Matt Baker, and thanks to everyone who attended for your time and attention. We do hope that you'll join us again for our next webinar. This will be titled, Can the Plan? How to Have a Career Conversation that Employees Really Want to Have. Registration is available with all of our other webinars at gpstrategies.com. I wish everyone a wonderful rest of your day.